Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. I might wait a little longer, but my goodness, you've been so kind to show up in such great numbers. I think we're running out of chairs anyway, so let's get started. Let me ask one question. How many of you have already heard the podcast we're going to be discussing today? Wow, okay, I'm actually quite surprised it's that few. So let me encourage you to listen to it, because we're responding to it. And insofar as we're doing that, we're giving you half the story. So if you haven't heard the first half yet, then it's unfair to only listen to us, but you should also, of course, listen to the original source first. My name is Paul Hilmer. My colleague here is Dr. Mary Ann Yang. We both teach here at Concordia University. And I think that's as much introduction as we need. Let's jump right in. We're hoping to have a robust conversation when this is all done. So the longer, I should say, the sooner I get started, the more time we'll have for that. Here we go. In September 24th, 2012, the highly acclaimed public radio program Radio Lab released a podcast entitled The Fact of the Matter. One of its segments, Yellow Rain, discussed the mysterious substance considered by many to be a Soviet chemical agent used to sicken or even kill people in Laos, Cambodia, and Afghanistan in the 1970s and 80s. The hosts of the show, Robert Krulwich and Jad Abumrad, and their producer, Pat Walters, repeated theories articulated by scientist Matthew Messelson 30 years earlier. Yellow rain, said Messelson, was not a chemical agent, but a shower of feces, yes, poop, excrement, from bees coming out of hibernation and defecating en masse. The sicknesses and deaths of Long and others allegedly attacked by yellow rain were all caused by natural phenomena, such as cholera and dysentery, said Messelson. These assertions were further supported by retired CIA officer Merle Pribino and Messelson's own research partner, Thomas Seeley. Though an earlier test at the University of Minnesota had found evidence of a man-made toxin in a sample provided by the State Department, Messelson asserted that the lab had unwittingly contaminated that sample. No alternative scientific explanation or analysis was offered, leaving listeners with the impression that science had conclusively determined that yellow rain was bee dung. Then Krulwich and Abumrad interviewed Eng Yang, a Hmong man who visited villages where yellow rain attacks allegedly occurred. Translating for him was his niece, celebrated memoirist Gaukelia Yang. Him to share a few details about his experiences and recollections, Krulwich and Abumrad began asking Yang if he was sure that yellow rain was a chemical agent. After all, a Harvard scientist had proven it was really bee dung. Suddenly, two well-intentioned men became prosecutors cross-examining a hostile witness. As far as I can tell, said Robert Krulwich, your uncle didn't see the bee pollen fall. Your uncle didn't see a plane. All of this is hearsay. Kalia's emotional response and abrupt end to the interview was met with a curious mix of outrage and mystification by Radiolab staff in a post-interview analysis. Her outburst, said Krulwich, was an indication of her desire to monopolize the story. What was the real story, according to Krulwich? That Ronald Reagan used yellow rain as a pretense to order the manufacture of chemical weapons. In fact, Abumrad would later insist that Krulwich's dogged questions were justified since, as he put it, the truth in this situation was a matter of life and death. But the three men knew something had gone wrong. Even so, their conclusion, at least publicly, was that in pursuing the truth about yellow rain, they ignored an equally, if not more important truth. Many Hmong people had died. And these emotional truths, as they called them, are the most powerful. Shortly after the podcast was released, angry responses streamed onto the Radiolab website. As of February 21st, there were, here I forgot to advance my slide. There were almost 1,250 comments, 6 times more than for any show in the previous 3 years. So how could such a highly decorated show put itself in a position to be attacked so angrily by so many people? While most commentary is focused on Radiolab's cultural, racial, and gender insensitivity, or on their dismissal of eyewitness testimony, we wish to explore an oft-dismissed, or oft-missed, I should say, case of this debacle: bad science. Radiolab staff acknowledge, let's try that again, there we go, They knew nothing about yellow rain until someone read a 1991 New Yorker article about the subject. Our theory is that Radiolab researchers met three congenial men with impressive credentials who sold them on the bee-dung theory, leading to confirmation bias which encouraged them to ignore any evidence challenging this theory. Much of the disaster that ensued emanated from this cardinal error. After providing information we consider essential in creating a broader context and considering the scientific method and the degree to which it was upheld in this particular story, we believe we will have supported our thesis, which is that open consultation of all scientific evidence suggests the need for continued investigation of yellow rain rather than a conclusion that allegations concerning yellow rain have been discredited. And that's a word that Matthew Messelson has used in his literature. A few statements of disclosure. First, we are both agnostic about yellow rain and have no desire to promote one theory over another. Second, my perspective on this story is far from objective or removed. I will lay out my involvement shortly. Thirdly, we will focus on the science employed by Radiolab in this episode. We believe that everyone in the story is an honorable person of good intent, though we clearly believe that grave mistakes were made and are now being denied. We would like to identify what we see as the frame Radiolab established in their podcast and continues to employ today. A frame, of course, is the way narrators establish the perspective from which the entirety of their work will be understood. Once the frame is established, the audience will follow the narrator's argument, accept the narrator's assumptions as legitimate, and be led to a specific conclusion. Radiolab's frame established that scientists have proven that yellow rain is bee-dung. As WNYC's president, Dean Capello, stated, this assertion came not only from Tribunal, Messelson, and Seeley's testimony, but from Pat Walter spending several months reviewing nearly 20 years' worth of academic papers and media reports on yellow rain. Hmong listeners noted that Radiolab did not translate Eng Yan's audible comment that the Hmong kept bees and knew what bee-dung looked like. Capello replied, numerous other lines of evidence contradicted his claims. In establishing this frame, Radiolab fueled the common perception that the disastrous interview resulted only from their impassioned search for the truth, and not by overdeveloped confidence in a less than ironclad theory. In fact, while trying to persuade Kaukalia Yang to meet privately with Jadam Bumraden himself, Capello wrote, your uncle's personal story has prompted many of my colleagues to express the desire to seek out more information about the history of the Hmong, and ultimately provoking that curiosity is at the heart of what we do. That frame now remains Hmong against the critics or even the curious of what occurred. When asked directly via email to explain his decision to exclude contradictory scientific evidence, Jadam Bumraden replied simply, I'm not going to get into a conversation about this story. Thank you. This frame extended beyond Radiolab itself and was articulated by Kelly McBride, Senior Faculty on Ethics and Reporting at the Poynter Institute. Speaking at the Third Coast International Audio Festival with Jadam Bumraden present, McBride weighed in on the Radiolab controversy. Since, she said, public outrage wasn't caused by factual inaccuracy, ethically, Radiolab didn't deceive anybody. They didn't get anything horribly wrong and cause damage by getting it wrong. They just framed their story in a way that discounted somebody else's story, and that was hurtful. Are these assertions accurate? Is this frame credible? We will argue they are not. Now for some backstory. On April 24th, 2012, I received an email from Radiolab producer Pat Walters. Would I be willing to help him find Hmong people willing to tell their story about a personal encounter with yellow rain? I agreed in part because I enjoyed the show, but mostly because Walters had been pointed in my direction by Dr. Rebecca Katz, who had completed a dissertation at Princeton in 2005 and co-authored an article with her dissertation advisor, Dr. Burton Singer, in 2007, casting serious doubts on the bee-dung theory. Surely, I thought, if they've spoken with Rebecca Katz, this piece will cover all the right bases. So I connected Walters with my friend Gabriel Young, a decision I now deeply regret. This involvement makes me a far less than objective source, and you are welcome to suspect everything I say today. Let me briefly summarize some of Dr. Katz's work and her findings. Having inherited several boxes of records from an associate of the Defense Intelligence Agency concerning Yellow Rain, she went on to file numerous Freedom of Information Act requests and helped declassify over 8,500 pages of documents. Her chief aim was not so much to determine the chemical composition of yellow rain, but to find the best explanation for what caused deaths and sicknesses amongst alleged yellow rain victims. She determined that maladies suffered by self-described victims, like the rash seen on this baby, could not be explained by naturally occurring means. Katz and Singer's article summarized many of the dissertation's findings and made all of the documents she declassified available electronically. I'll leave the discussion of methodology to Dr. Yang, but here are some of the key findings. 1. Many yellow rain samples were not really yellow rain. The most legitimate samples were collected prior to 1983, before the public hunt for a Soviet chemical agent tainted the process. 2. Between 1979 and 1982, clinical complaints about and findings among self-described victims and detailed refugee accounts of attacks were sufficiently similar in Laos, Cambodia, and Afghanistan to suggest a key common factor, most plausibly a Soviet link. 3. Epidemiological evidence was consistent with mass simultaneous poisoning and not any natural disease. 4. 75% of alleged attacks coincided with witnesses seeing or hearing a helicopter or airplane, followed by seeing or smelling a gas or powder fall to the ground. 5. Between 1979 and 1982, refugee reports of attacks were consistent with other intelligence data, including known battles and flight paths of aircraft, more than 60% of the time. 6. If these toxins are not stored properly, they degrade over time, meaning it is certainly possible that a sample tested at the University of Minnesota could test positive and then later test negative. While there are other findings, I hope these data sufficiently demonstrate that Katz's work posed a serious scientific challenge to the be-done theory. This photo is taken from a 2006 conference in London, sponsored by the Center for Contemporary Conflict, the United States Naval Postgraduate School, and King's College in London. You will note that for a high-level discussion on yellow rain, both Matthew Messelson and Rebecca Katz have a seat at the table. One might ask why Radiolab didn't take the same approach. First, we must acknowledge that owing to her role as a consultant for the State Department, Rebecca Katz could not speak publicly about this issue. But Radiolab had access to her dissertation, her co-authored article, and Dr. Singer was able to speak. So why didn't Radiolab say anything about this research? Was Katz's approach less scientific or less credible than Messelson's? I thought I would ask a scientist that very question. And so I yield the floor to my colleague, Dr. Marianne Yang.
So first, I really want to thank Paul for inviting me onto this project and presentation, because interdisciplinary collaboration has been at the heart of my passion, and to actually able to work with a historian on a piece of story that really showcased the importance of good scientific method is really just priceless for me. So first, I want to talk about, this is like Bio 101 really for all my students. Not only PhD can practice, or from Harvard can practice scientific method, it really only follows these steps: observation, hypothesis, testing, analysis, conclusion, and then maybe more critical thinking, and then more testable hypothesis. So for people that maybe have Bio 101 too long ago, I'll give you some good examples. For example, in the winter, it was cold, you woke up, want to go to work, car won't start, observation. Hypothesis, drain battery, maybe, That is your hypothesis. The car has a drain battery. Hypothesis is always a statement, not a question. So you test it by jumping your car. Now would it start now? It started. Conclusion, the drain battery is the problem. Maybe it didn't, the car won't start. Okay, that was your analysis. So drain battery wasn't the problem. Then you go on to critical thinking. Could it be that the battery no longer store or holds electricity anymore? And then you can to test my hypothesis. Scientific method, we all practice it almost every day. The words are really small, and I apologize, but I really want to fit it all into one diagram to show everyone. So up here, just as Paul has laid out, we really have two possible hypotheses here. I really call them hypothesis and not theory, and we can discuss more about what that is in scientific terms. But the first one is actually presented by Rebecca Cass and Singer, which started with the observation that during the alleged time of yellow rain, Hmong people saw a plane flying overhead showering down yellow substance and subsequently found severe sickness. That was the observation. Correlation, nothing direct, conclusive. However, you have an observation now. And therefore, they formulated a hypothesis that yellow rain is toxin, therefore causing severe sickness. And obviously, there's other bodies of evidence that eventually led to this. And thus, the next thing, right, you test. Is it really true that this claim will hold up? And that sample, as Paul has suggested, was collected and sent and analyzed by Dr. Muroka at UFM. And the result is that he confirmed presence of mycotoxin, and therefore we can draw the conclusion, in scientific terms, we always say we fail to reject the hypothesis, which means we have no grounds to say that hypothesis was wrong. But science can never fully prove something, so then obviously we can go on to have more critical thinking and others. And so in that sense, we can also come up with possible critical thinking and say, okay, it could be mycotoxin, but would the level of mycotoxin detected cause those severe sickness? Right, does that make sense? And the next thing is then, does those sickness correlate with mycotoxin? So there's other things that could be then tested, and that's scientific method. And in this case, I would say that there is grounds for Radiolab to at least present this piece that's been scientifically tested. For the next hypothesis, which is what Menselson has kind of presented, started with the observation that in 1982, there are scientists that found yellow rain contained bee pollen, and this was then independently confirmed by U.S. Army with their own sample. So they come up with really, and this hypothesis is what I drafted after hearing the podcast, is that their hypothesis that yellow rain is just being done, and that mistaken by Hmong people, and that really pretty shines through through the podcast that they also made that assumption or that piece part of their hypothesis that it's just being done and it's been mistaken by Hmong people. And so what's next, right? This was also came about because Menselson was discussing with Seeley and heard that southeastern bee would come out of hibernation and would defecate en masse, and it could look like yellow rain. They went there, they saw the effect. So that's the next. Their testing was that they went to Thailand, Southeastern Asia, and saw the yellow rain effect. However, first of all, they're not really the Hmong people that claim to have seen the yellow rain. And I must say that does not test the hypothesis. What I was proposed is a hypothesis 2.1, which is the still same observations, probably the same hypothesis without the assumption of mistaken by Hmong, but just say yellow rain is just being done, does not have mycotoxin. Because I believe that is at the heart of what science can really prove. And then I would suggest what you would test is the sample that was found to have pollen for then testing for presence of mycotoxin. Okay? So if there's no mycotoxin and just yellow rain, then you can start to be testing that hypothesis that they brought about. I'm not really sure how to test the mistaken by multiple part. But scientifically, I feel like that is a better version than what has been presented during the podcast. And so this is kind of my personal evaluation of the scientific method that's been employed by both hypotheses. And here's what I feel like I found with the second hypothesis that's been presented. That it really wasn't fully tested. The hypothesis was just that there are Southeastern Asian bees that come out of dormation and will defecate en masse. That's what they saw that. But as what is its connection to yellow rain, I don't feel like it was scientifically linked and proven. What was proven was that scientifically there is bee pollen in yellow rain, but nothing was tested to exclude the presence of mycotoxin. And next, the assumption that all people mistaken is just really qualitative and hard to test. The excluded evidence of severe sickness that was correlated with the yellow rain also wasn't addressed, but was kind of stated by Paul, just dismissed, saying that that was just mistaken by most people to link to yellow rain. So I really want to, again, circle back to scientific method. What will be the problem if you make all these assumptions and exclude evidence and picking and choosing of data? And I feel like this YouTube video, which talks about how making assumptions, selection of data, can lead to bad judgment and therefore bad conclusions.
A set of 6 rungs on a metaphorical ladder that we climb to get from what we see to what we believe and what we do about it. Down here on the bottom rung is the first level. This is called observable data. Observable data is everything we might capture in a situation if we're capturing it with a camera. So let's say you're at a staff meeting with 5 of your employees. One of them is giving a presentation, pointing at the board. One of them is shifting in her chair, checking her BlackBerry. One of them is taking notes, etc. All of that is observable data. From there, you move to the next rung, which is selected data.
My bad, sorry folks.
It's too much data to process, so you select some of that data and you ignore the rest. Let's say you choose to focus in on the employee who's shifting in her chair, checking her watch, and checking her BlackBerry. From there, you move to the next rung, which is assumptions. Assumptions are where you start to add meaning. You might look at her and say, she seems uncomfortable. From there, you move to conclusions, the next rung. You might say, I think she's uncomfortable because there's something she doesn't want to say or doesn't want to share. Now, if you see that behavior a couple times, you might go to the next level, which is beliefs. Beliefs are what you come to think about the situation. You might come to believe that this employee doesn't share forthrightly when she has something to say. And if you believe that, you'll probably take action. You'll probably go off and do something, like start to ask her more questions directly to elicit those things she's just not saying. Now, why?
Oh my goodness. Oh, perfect. I love technology. That's right. It's a communist conspiracy.
They sabotage us already, Paul.
Oh, just give me a second. I got your back.
What?
The name of the club flag.
I don't know. What did you say?
Okay, we went through all those assumptions about this employee with the BlackBerry, and then...
Action. Oh. And then it's stuck.
What's the name of the
Now
club?
it's... Now I've done it. It doesn't want to play.
Go back a little bit.
I think we get the point.
Yeah, well,
Can you give the name of the clip? Just the name of the clip?
the name of the clip?
Yeah, it's I can't read it from here. The labor of influence causes bad judgment. It's all the way in the top.
Ladder of, yeah, the ladder.
The ladder.
The ladder of, that's what he was drawing, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The
the
rungs of the
ladder.
ladder.
The ladder.
Okay, I think you guys get the. So then, so the bad thing about this, obviously this wasn't what does lead to then beliefs, which isn't part of scientific method. And he's going to go on and talk about how that's going to then form a bad loop of choices down to selected data. So when you think that's what's going on, then you might start to select your own data. And I kind of feel like that is the problem that's presented here leading to bad judgment, was that they have this belief in isolated selected data and then reinforce that. And he's going to go on to then talk about how to kind of move away from this, and that's moving down the ladder and look for alternative data or a possible explanation for the same observed situation. And in this case, there is that obvious hypothesis one that was presented by Rebecca Katz. And therefore, again, I feel like it's more about promoting the fact that to make a conclusive conclusion about yellow rain as a program that promotes science, they really should present both sides, or not both sides, any evidence that's out there concerning this topic for the listener in that sense, to really then address the scientific piece of discussion here.
So I'd like to spend a little time introducing some evidence that Radiolab didn't share from people that they sometimes actually consulted, but then didn't use. Before I proceed, a couple of caveats, especially for those who have not heard the podcast or are not familiar with the science of yellow rain. First, please understand that everyone I interviewed spoke of Dr. Matthew Messelson in the highest of respect, and I wish to do the same. He is a world-class Nobel Prize-winning biologist. Second, we are focusing here on information that Radiolab excluded from their podcast, not because we believe it should replace their content, but because at least some of it should have been placed alongside it. Oops. Dr. Chester Moroka is the unnamed scientist in Radiolab's story who, at least according to Matthew Messelson, allowed a sample of yellow rain to become contaminated. Moroka not only upholds his original findings and finds the bee feces theory, or hypothesis, untenable, but goes so far as to suggest that Matthew Messelson, a signatory to the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, has a motive to prove there was no chemical weapons used by the USSR. He scoffs at the idea the Hmong and others knew nothing about bees and bee defecation, and finally points out that Dr. Messelson made an error in 1992 when he initially posited that an anthrax outbreak in Russia was naturally generated, and then later had to concede that not only had anthrax deaths been caused by an anthrax production plant, but that the plant existed in direct violation of the Biological Weapons Convention. I interviewed Dr. Katz for my book before she began working as a State Department consultant. Let me share just one quote, which makes her conclusions clear. The bee feces theory is at some levels just really ridiculous, mostly because it didn't address all of the evidence. They proved 100% that there is a naturally occurring phenomenon of Asian honeybees that defecate en masse in certain parts of the world, and that it falls in a way that looks like yellow rain. But that has nothing to do with any accounts of morbidity and mortality. It doesn't account for anything that happens in Afghanistan, where those bees are not known to exist. It doesn't account for any of the corroboration and triangulation of military overflights and intelligence data. Dr. Burton Singer, Rebecca Katz's dissertation advisor at Harvard, was previously the chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at Yale. Singer said that he and Katz both wanted Dr. Messelson to serve on her dissertation committee. But according to Singer, it quickly became evident that Messelson was only interested in defending his own ideas, not assessing the new evidence. When he was not invited to serve on the committee, Messelson contacted both the president of Princeton and the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, complaining that Katz's committee lacked proper supervision. I can imagine how Dr. Singer felt about that. If Messelson truly felt Katz's findings were wrong, says Singer, he could have, and still could, study them and publish a repudiation, but he hasn't. Singer truly believes that objective study of the data Katz collected points convincingly to the use of chemical weapons. Finally, He noted that someone from Radiolab did contact him. He did lay out all of the arguments against Messelson's theories, and then never heard from them again. Finally, let's turn to General Michael Meese, who in 1980 was serving as an intern at the State Department, where the first reports of yellow rain attacks began to emerge. During that time, he cataloged 114 eyewitness accounts and newspaper articles alleging yellow rain use. He also reminded me that the first U.S. government charges of chemical weapons use against the Soviet Union occurred during the Jimmy Carter administration, and in fact, United States pressure led to a United Nations resolution against the use of chemical and bacteriological weapons. While he acknowledges that scientific evidence must be the ultimate arbiter of truth regarding yellow rain, his time collecting evidence, as well as his time serving on Rebecca Katz's dissertation committee, have convinced him that some form of chemical or biological agent was used against Damon and other victims. These are not all, but certainly constitute a critical mass of information we feel should have compelled Radiolab to create a more balanced piece about yellow rain. And if they had conducted their research more objectively, they would never put themselves in the position to question Pyongyang as harshly as they did. A popular and highly regarded radio program disseminates a podcast that angers and offends even people who know nothing about the Hmong or yellow rain, after choosing to exclude scientific evidence that legitimately challenges the assumptions undergirding their entire story. How do they respond? Here are the most obvious answers I can imagine, listed roughly, at least for my biased opinion, in descending order of journalistic credibility. 1, admit your mistake, release a retraction and or clarification, and move on. This is, after all, the essence of the journalistic method. 2, silence your critics by releasing the science that refutes them and exculpates you. 3, insist that you are correct, but admit that other theories about yellow rain exist. 4, assert that your show is not about truth, evidence, science, or objectivity, as many commenters to the website did after the show aired, thereby at least recontextualizing your message, if not vindicating your position. Or last, which is of course what Radiolab has chosen to do nothing, and hope that the issue goes away. As I hope we've managed to convey, our goal today is not to disparage the individuals whose work we critique in this story, nor to insist that yellow rain was a Soviet-produced chemical toxin. Our goal is to share scientific evidence and perspectives intentionally omitted from the Radiolab podcast and ask why they were omitted. Since Radiolab is unwilling to explain their scientific and editorial choices, and we find their frame suspect, we can only speculate regarding their motives, which would be unproductive. We have chosen to focus not on issues of injustice, racism, or power, which are valid, but which obscure a flaw which needs to be publicly addressed. The artificial dichotomy Radiolab created between a Harvard biologist and a Hmong man. And that dichotomy proved effective. The comments on the screen suggest that for many, Radiolab's frame was persuasive. They believe Matthew Messelson's theory is fact. Even if this is not unjust, and many would say it is unscientific. So if we are to extend our thesis beyond this room and back into the public arena that Radiolab continues to occupy, we will need to meet them on their own alleged ground, the ground of scientific evidence, and assert that the question of yellow rain has still not been conclusively answered. Thank you. As you might imagine, we would love to hear your comments, your questions, your challenges of our evidence or our assumptions. Any and all are welcome. Yes, please. Well, what they are arguing
Can you
is
repeat
that...
the question, please?
Oh, yeah. So they're saying if it was just beat down, shouldn't the diseases that the Hmong people suffered continue on into the present? Is that a fair representation of your question? And what Matthew Messelson and Thomas Seeley are saying is that it's because of this refugee experience. They're running, they're hiding, they're living in the jungle, they're starving, they're being exposed to the elements. And so cholera, dysentery, starvation, these were the things that caused the rashes, the bleeding, the deaths that are associated with the Hmong experience and escape from Laos and New Zealand. That's what they would say. I think I'm fairly representative. But again, question everything I say. Yes, please.
Back in the Ban Benai camp.
Please speak loudly.
Yeah, I was first, when we in the Ban Benai camp, right, we talk about yellow rain, right? Yeah, I live to my neighbors, my neighbor is used to going back to Laos. He's the one who collects those yellow rain, and then every day there's a couple of lab expertise from Dutch, from around the country come and talk to him, and we're going to ask him about yellow rain. But would you think that it's the reason why the United States and the UN doesn't recognize it is because the United States abandoned Laos, they don't want to care about much about the Hmong people? Is a part of they say, forget this thing. We don't want to get in touch with this thing. And that's why they don't want to recognize that as a real chemical that have been used in Laos?
Well, but keep in mind that there was condemnation against the Soviet Union and against Vietnam by the Carter administration and by the Reagan administration. And so this is a statement made not on behalf of the United States government, but on behalf of a biologist who's promoting a specific theory. And again, I'm not saying his theory or his hypothesis, pardon me, Dr. Yang, I'm a historian, not a scientist. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong, but I'm saying this is sort of what he's built his career on. And so this is the opinion that he has based on the evidence that he has collected. And he has promoted it, and Radiolab has bought it. And so I think what we're trying to say, maybe not very well, is that Radiolab encountered these three very impressive men and immediately thought, okay, we've got this story wrapped up. Now we just have to go around and sort of dust around the edges and collect a few more things for window dressing, but we already have our story. And the other thing that's very clear if you read their post-podcast comments, and even what I mentioned from Robert Krulwich saying is, the story is that Ronald Reagan took us into a new era of chemical warfare. And he justified it by claiming that this stuff that was really just bee poop was really chemicals. And so it's also a less than oblique critique of Ronald Reagan. And I will be perfectly honest in saying, I don't have a problem with that personally, but that's just me. But I do have a problem with it when you're not using information that's actually, or at least has not been proven to be accurate. So I think those are some of the assumptions within the story that guided them and then guided their audience to make certain conclusions. Please.
Is it, I mean, you called your presentation ignorance and bias. So I see two things. Number one, you said the Hmong story really is only window dressing. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
And then the other part of it is like looking at indigenous people like the Hmong as how could they possibly have scientific, any explanation of scientific value because they don't have that. So how could they possibly be their observations or their conclusions be more valuable than that observation that scientists?
Well,
so,
and
the
again,
bias really is that you basically take anything that comes from the Hmong community. Number one, it wasn't that important. It was kind of, like you said, an afterthought. We have to talk to some people who are actually there.
Yeah.
And then really not taking it seriously as fact or as information.
But one of the things that disturbs me the most is that even people who are highly critical of this podcast are basically critical of Robert Krulwich, who hurt people's feelings. Right? Well, you were right, but you shouldn't have talked that way to these people. These poor victims. And so they successfully created a dichotomy between the scientific evidence and the eyewitness evidence. And what we're saying is that is a false dichotomy.
Because for these people, really feeling the only valid faith, whatever. So it's a double bias.
Well, but what I'm saying, I guess, is if they would have shared with us and thought carefully about the cat's singer work and incorporated that into the story, there's no way you sit down with Eng Yang and say, you're wrong. You're wrong. Science proves you're wrong. You can't do that. And so crisis averted. But instead, they were convinced, and again, I don't think this is a conspiracy. I don't think these are evil people. I simply think they were convinced that science had proven something. And they just marched forward with that. And so, yes, then the interview becomes the debacle. When instead, all you have to do is ask Mr. Yang what he experienced, thank him, leave. And even then, if you want to do something with the story based on your scientific opinion, or maybe you ask him what he thinks, but again, you don't have to keep coming back to him and asking the same question. And for that, of course, Robert Krulwich did apologize. But I'm still trying to get them. I've contacted, as you might guess, numerous individuals, numerous organizations, and I still want someone to say publicly, we misled the public about the science related to this issue. And again, not because I know that yellow rain is a chemical toxin, I don't know. But I'm not sure anybody does. And again, that's the question.
So who's funding these gentlemen that did the research?
Well, the research goes back to the 1980s. So that's long done. And Matthew Messelson is now retired from Harvard University. But again, he's a scientist promoting his view. That's what scientists do. Now, you may have noticed the quote that I did actually read out loud from Rebecca Cathy. She said, I was amazed at how much personality gets in the way of science. And so I think that's what even admirers of Dr. Messelson might say, which is, this is a man who's decided he's right and he's just marching forward. He's not interested in challenges to his hypothesis. But Radiolab, again, I don't know why they didn't just come forward and say, we're sorry we made a mistake, here's a competing theory, and move on. That to me is the easiest and most honest thing to do. But instead, Radiolab, which is a national public radio show, but it's out of WNYC in New York City, they're the ones who made the editorial decisions, not any particular scientist. And again, I don't think they did it out of malice. I don't think they meant to create this. I think they're quite embarrassed by it.
But you're suggesting that they have, in psychology, we refer to it as lacking cognitive flexibility.
I'll go with that, yes, sir. Lacking cognitive flexibility. Can I use that? Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
It's not your personal phrase? Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. Oh, yes. Oh, which over there? Ian?
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with all the conclusions that you made. I'm just wondering if in one of the real problems, I mean, I'm a committed relativist, right? And so I'm wondering if it's, to some degree, there's too much faith in the scientific method to begin with, because the scientific method is always contaminated by bias. Bias cannot be taken away from that. And so that's the problem with both the Radiolab people and Messelson, you know, in that they believe too much that they can be objective, and therefore they fail to recognize that there's a likelihood that they're not going to be objective.
Oh, and so what you have here is a kind of perfect storm.
Yeah,
in which you have a committed biologist who believes he's right and who has the reputation to back it up. And a show that, by the way, Janet Woodrock got a MacArthur Genius Award. I'm sure that did nothing for his ego. Okay? So you have a show that's hailed as being a show occupied by at least one genius, maybe more, that's consulting a Nobel Prize-winning Harvard biologist. Well, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? So, to some degree, I can understand why they might say, we have the story. But again, you know, in history, in geography, and in so many other academic disciplines, our responsibility is to find the underreported story, to speak for the underdog, to back up and get a broader perspective. And journalism seems to me certainly a very appropriate avenue for this as well. Plus, it's a show called The Fact of the Matter, right? And it's a show about science. And I think what Marianne says is science is just as good as the theory backing up whatever's being promoted. So yeah, any scientist with her or his salt is going to say, yeah, unless we've sewn this up, and maybe even if we've sewn this up, we're still open to a competing theory. Wasn't there a theory recently that we decided the age of the universe is only maybe 15 billion instead of 30 billion years old or something like that? I know you're a biologist.
Right,
not a
but I
physicist.
can, tell you so much about how many theory in biology did not hold true. In the end, there's always exception, especially in applied. And so that's always the kicker or the interesting thing about biology is that you always find exceptions because, the whole time that DNA, I don't know, DNA is the genetic material. I know we saw HIV virus that wasn't, which caused AIDS, and it wasn't DNA. It was RNA. And so that this happens over and over and over again. And so if you're not open-minded and look at evidence and you select and choose, then you really have that judgment and like that.
Yes, please.
So maybe to kind of go off of what you said, I like your presentation. I agree with everything you say too, but I think in some ways you're getting the conversation with people who are relegated to this right elite, people who have these PhDs and are of science, where I think the conversation, I know you said you should take out or not have race of power, but I think in some ways you have to have a conversation about race of power. You can't move that outside of this conversation.
Yeah.
Because in some ways I feel like if we are only going to have a conversation about science, then we're always having this white science that's going to either say that this is right, that we're telling the lived experience of people of color. I think that's problematic. So when you're using the science to say, oh yes, this actually did happen, or oh yes, this didn't happen. And I think this conversation is in a much larger conversation. And I don't think that obviously this is something that has just happened to most people. I'm sure it happened to people of color who experience many things who science is used to either dismiss their lived realities or to acknowledge the things they experience. And so in some way, I understand what you're trying to do, but I think it also then takes the experience of most people as if it's something that's outside of science.
Well, I completely agree with what you're saying. By the same token, the reason that I say it this way is that you can find all those other things in abundance already. Okay, so we're trying to add something new to the equation. You can go to the Radiolab website, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of comments about these very things. Some of them from me, right? So I in no way am trying to find any fault with what you just said. I hardly concur. But again, the idea was we're trying to bring something to the table that hasn't been brought there already. And so that's why we focused on this. But I hardly concur with everything you said. Yes, please.
Well, you position this as a conversation about scientific method. Really, it's also the intersection of journalism and journalistic freedom and scientific method. And since you're a historian, I'm wondering if you can perhaps also position this within other conversations or arguments over the last several decades that have raised similar kinds of questions that can help us to help you with this.
Well, I, for example, in my American history class, just finished talking about the home front in World War II. And we talked about the relocation of Japanese Americans because not just a sort of race perception, but perceptions about whether someone from another country can possibly be loyal to their new home. Assumptions made by President Roosevelt, certainly assumptions made by the press. And so a lot of the stories that were circulated at that time painted people in a monolithic way, in a pejorative way, and depicted them as threats and simply incapable of repositioning or redefining themselves. And I think that's what we see here as well. Certainly in the wake of 9/11, as we see attitudes about Muslim Americans. And again, not just the sort of popular approach, but what we saw in the press from time to time also was a way of sort of buying into the war agenda of the administration at the time, or the sentiment that came out of this country based on the attacks that have been perpetrated against our country. You can go back and look at the yellow journalism leading up to the Spanish-American War, how we saw the Spanish, how we saw Cubans we saw Filipinos. So yeah, I think the press has often not served us well. Surprise, surprise, right? Biggest controversial statement I've made today. But there again, the press is only as good as we make it be. And I guess to me, that's one of the reasons I've chosen this round, and Marianne has been kind enough to support me and say, yeah, go. Because to me, in order to at least try to get them to talk about the mistake they made, we have to go to their ground. And we have to say, we think you've made these errors about science, about the scientific method, about assumption, that you need to rectify publicly. Because the assumptions that were incorrect are certainly out there publicly, are certainly part of the public record. I even emailed Kelly, I forget her name already, from the Poynter Institute, and I said, you made this comment that's now a part of the public record. I think you should consider whether that's truly accurate or not. Here's Rebecca Katz's article. Please read it. Now, I doubt very much I'll ever hear from her. I can imagine what she thinks of me, my old crackpot, of bringing up the issue that's more than a year old. That's okay. But as a historian, right, that's what I do, is to say, here's the public story. What's missing? And yes, there's a lot about culture, power, gender, all sorts of other things that need to be brought into this story. But again, the one that hasn't been talked about much to this point is about how even where they say they got it right, they got it wrong.
Paul?
Yes?
There's a part of this that you didn't talk about today that I wish would have happened, so I'll bring it up.
Okay.
You talked about how science and the observations of most people in the mountains can come together on this issue. If, as there were these episodes of pollen falling, there were concurrent episodes of probably aerial and some distribution of gaseous poison, the two concur, which is not an unusual observation. So these things can help explain why, among traditionalists' perspective, these things would match the science.
Yeah.
I don't think that he just made up out of the blue that pollen fell and people got sick. These things were probably happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So it probably was yellow rain as pollen and microtoxins.
Yeah, good point indeed. And of course, in addition to that, as we said, some things that were collected and analyzed as if they were yellow rain really weren't yellow rain. They probably were just bee pollen.
Yes.
And I think the other thing, too, that we must acknowledge is that there were undoubtedly some Hmong refugees who got sick and didn't know why, but they blamed it on yellow rain. It became kind of like a boogeyman. And again, I don't say
what's
that.
interesting about that is that's not just something that would occur in a culture where science was taught in schools. There were no schools teaching things at that time in the hills. That happens today in this culture, broadly speaking.
Yeah,
also that happens in people's parents, and now therefore, that caused it. That's actually a common human phenomenon, not a phenomenon of white scientists among people in China or people in South America. It's just a human phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe one or two more comments before we all go to lunch, or are you done?
Thank you.
I guess we're done. Thank you.